It's interesting. I go on these trips, like the one I mentioned at the top of the conversation that I just came back from, to stay connected to what really matters to me. And I found myself feeling very kind of melancholy last night. I was so grateful to be home to my two sons and my wife, but I was also very sad to be away from this experience that I look forward to all year. And I was thinking about why and really just letting the emotion exist, to some of our earlier points. And what I realized was that in a moment where you are away from all outside influence, and it's you and 12 other people, all of whom you care about and are there for a reason, the purpose of life in that moment gets very clear. It's just to be present here with these people that I care about. It's being in environments with people that create the space for transformation, for people to change towards whatever it is they're capable of or whatever it is they want more of in their life. And if I can be a catalyst for that, whether it's through hosting a dinner party or a fishing trip or taking on coaching clients or hosting my podcast, for these moments of transformation that call people to a higher version of what they're capable of being. And maybe occasionally, if I can inspire them to go apply that somewhere that's of great service in the world. I think about every one of those stories as being the kind of person that would want to be at your funeral on the last day of your life and would want to be able to tell that story as an example of who you were and the kind of influence you had, the kind of influence I had. I just don't think there's anything better. If I had a couple hundred people in the room sharing that kind of story, I think that's a life well lived.
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on this show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. My guest today is Barrett Brooks. He helps founders of mission-driven companies grow into CEOs capable of making an impact at scale. He is an executive coach, host of a popular podcast, Good Work, and author of a weekly newsletter on leading well. Barrett, how are you? So nice to see you.
So good. It's great to be here. I'm just on the back of a 3-day trip out in the wilderness fishing, and this is the first thing I've done since I've gotten back. So I'm full of energy and excited to be here.
I love it. And I want to hear more about that trip. I spent a lot of time in cabins in the woods a few years ago when the pandemic sent us home. And I have fond memories of that time. What was it like? Is it something you do regularly? You get away?
Yeah, it is. This is actually an annual trip I started hosting coming off the pandemic. I realized I just was lacking community and really wanted to connect with people, especially friends who were spread out across the country. And just the weird element of internet culture is that you end up with friends in cities all over. So I wanted an excuse to get them all together. And I had once had a friend tell me about this trip he took. It was 3 days and 2 nights rafting and fishing with guides. And so I found a guide shop here in Oregon, and they cook all the food and set up camp and tie all your flies and everything. And you just get to kind of experience it. And so we spent 7 guys came in, 8 of us went out with 4 guides, spent 3 days and 2 nights just out in the wilderness with no technology, no cell service or anything. It was wonderful. It's kind of an annual restoration trip for me.
Well, I love the sound of that. Isn't it funny that technology brought a lot of you together, and
Yes.
then you get away from technology to be
Yes.
together? I think
That's
there's
the
a
modern
lesson in
world.
there.
There is,
Yeah.
for sure.
Barrett, I want to jump right in. I have a million questions about the work you do and the experience you've had. You know that. But I want to start from the beginning. And you might have listened to my podcast, so you know that I ask my guests about the early days. I think there's some treasures there to discover. But I want to hear about your childhood upbringing and how you think that time shaped you, your relationship with career. I say money a lot on this show, but let's say, career, and anything else you want to share about that time.
Yeah. Well, any childhood is shaped by parents or the absence of parents. And I have 2 parents who are wonderful. They're still married to this day. And I learned a lot from both of them. My mom was actually the primary breadwinner in our family, so she went to work every day. And I like to say that many days she was a lot more like a coach than a mom. So I come by it honestly. But she was the kind of person who really helped me find the edges of my potential. She was always pushing me to do better, strive for more, attempt more. And there were some really beautiful aspects of that. There's been some aspects I've had to unlearn where, I think there are times where I push myself too hard. I'm a little overly critical. I can kind of get in my own head about whether I'm doing enough in the world. And so there's been a lot of things that I've had to kind of work through in that realm to make sure that I'm being appropriately satisfied with the things I've actually done and not just focused on what I've yet to do. But every great quality comes with a shadow side, so that makes sense. And then on my dad's end, he stayed home with us. He took care of my brother and I, and cooked all our meals, was there after school for us, and he did some handy work during the day. But what I learned from him was true servant leadership. He was always around, always there to take care of us, and I know it was a hard role to be in. It can be an emasculating role to be in, I think, at times, for your wife to be the one earning a living. And I think he found a way to be both very masculine, but also very nurturing and taking care of us over time. And that's something that's really shaped my career, is that I find that when I show up in teams, when I manage people, when I'm building relationships, I have a very nurturing and kind of open and inviting style, a very vulnerable style. And oftentimes that can put me at conflict actually with male colleagues in many cases, where I kind of come across like a little bit of an alien, because it's not the typical kind of masculine traits you might expect at work. But I found that to serve me really well. If I need to turn on the competitive athletic gene, I can do that. I grew up playing a lot of sports and am definitely highly competitive, love to play a game and try and win. But at the end of the day, I'm kind of about developing people. And I think that's this perfect merging of my parents and the way that they raised me. My mom kind of with the striving, coaching, achievement side, and my dad with this kind of servant leadership, nurturing, taking care of people side. And so those were both beautiful aspects. And then the third thing that I'll say about growing up is nature and animals and the Discovery Channel and National Geographic and camping trips and a lot of things like this were really prominent parts of how I grew up. And honestly, I didn't like it a lot at the time. Some of the camping trips, it's like, oh, I just want to be with my friends. What are we doing out here in the woods? And now I realize that so much of that shapes my views and my emphasis on solving climate change or protecting nature and ecosystems, or even just getting outside like we were talking about with friends, that being embedded early on in my life just really built this inherent value for beauty in the world, natural beauty in the world, and wanting to protect that and preserve that for a long time to come. So there's 3 elements for you. I'm sure I could go on forever, but those are a couple of the ones that have shaped me.
Who was the one organizing those trips out to the woods? Your dad?
That's funny. I think it was my dad. Yeah, he grew up in northern Wisconsin, out in the middle of nowhere. We just took a trip this year. I called it a legacy trip to go see where he grew up. And I mean, it is the middle of nowhere, northern Wisconsin. And they lived in a little cabin on a lake up there. No running water, no electricity. They went to the bathroom in an outhouse. And I just think he finds a lot of peace outside. He finds a lot of kind of joy and hope and just peacefulness when we're in the woods. So I think he was the one that planned those and made us get out there. And my mom tolerated it and grew to love it over time.
And you still feel the calling. You keep going to the woods.
I do.
I took so many notes. I want to bring up a few things. You said finding the edges of my potential. And I'm an investor. I invest money for people, and I'm thinking of the circle of competence, how you continuously expand that circle of competence, the companies, the businesses that you own, and on the client side, the issues and the problems and the challenges that you understand. I also wrote down for myself, empathy, compassion, understanding, listening to you. And in my business, it's very relevant because we think it's a numbers game. But there are people behind the accounts and the portfolios. The same way there are people behind every single business, and not just the employees, but the customers and all the stakeholders, right? And it takes a lot to understand how much of an impact you have on other people's lives. And you said taking care of people. I grew up with this idea of being of service to people. I had 2 physicians, doctors in the household growing up, my parents, and they would go out and help people, even though they would never be paid for a lot of that help, especially if it was, an emergency or random things. And managing money for people, even today, I was spending time with a client solving a problem. You're just needed, and you go in and you help. And I find it fascinating if you find something like that in your life that pulls you this way. And Barrett, I have a big picture question. Your podcast, your essays, your work is all about impact at scale to build a more beautiful future. Tell me more about that mission, vision that you have.
Yeah. It's funny, for so much of my life, I think, especially my adult life, I've kind of fought this urge or this mission. And the way I describe the mission for myself is that it's 2 halves. The first half is to help people unlock their full potential and realize what they're capable of. And the second is to use that potential to solve important problems in the world, to be of service, to make an impact. And I don't know exactly where that's rooted. If we go back to the childhood thing, we did a lot of days of service where we'd go out with our church group or just with a community service group and participate in Habitat for Humanity, or we had this day at our church called Great Day of Service where we'd go out and we'd paint homes or repair homes for people who didn't have the budget to do it for themselves. And so this is a big element of just really deeply embedded from the age of, 6 or 7. We were out doing these service projects and just being very other oriented in the world. And I think something about that really shaped the way that I view kind of everything. That if you're in the world and you have gifts, number one, it's your job to exercise them. Like it's a waste of your potential, but also it's robbing the world of something if you don't actually realize what's within you and go out and try and find ways to exercise that. But then also I've seen so many people over the years orient towards what end up being empty goals, things that they think will fulfill them or fill a hole in kind of their soul level of who they are. And ultimately it comes to pass and they achieve the thing and they're no happier than they were before. But when I see people who orient towards service and impact and solving things that are creating pain or hardship or just holding humanity back in some way, when I see people who are working on that, it's like they have an endless supply of energy. Especially, the limit of that is there can be this martyrdom syndrome where you kind of end up like sacrificing yourself on behalf of others. And I think that can be the unhealthy side. But everything up to that, it's almost like there's this endless well of reason to keep going because you see what's happening in the world. You see the way that you're changing people's lives through the work that you do. And that message can get kind of bastardized a little bit. Of course, there's like greenwashing and other ways that businesses can try and market towards this when it's not really there. But for the most part, what I find is when you have someone who is exploring the edges of what they're capable of, to go back to the way that my mom pushed me, and also oriented towards serving others, what I learned from my dad, they really find a deep sense of just, I guess, peace. There's this sense of I am enough. I know what I am capable of, and I am using my gifts in the world every day. And I don't know that there's a better feeling than that, at least when it comes to the career. There's a whole other home side to all of this, but we spend most of our time at work. And so for me, I really like the core message is if you don't like what you do every day, or you don't feel what you do every day as being of service to others, go find something else. Surely, if you're talented enough to be in a job where people are paying you every day, you could use those same skills towards some cause or some problem or some important area of impact that will help you feel better about why you show up every day. And I think that's a change almost everyone can make. And I'm not even prescribing what the problems are. Everyone has different problems that are personal to them. But I think that when people find that area where they know deep down, this matters enough to spend my time on it, they show up differently, both in their personal lives and professional.
There's so many things I'm going to come back to, but I want to ask you about a specific experience you had. You were the COO of ConvertKit that grew revenue 10x, the team 3x. And I wrote down it was bootstrapped and fully remote before it was cool to be remote. Can you talk about that experience? What was it like? What have you learned?
It was such a formative experience. I think it's really the core of, it was the testing ground for what I thought I knew about leadership. That was the place where I said, okay, all of these ideas that I've read about or that I think might be true about what people need in a leader, here is a place where I can test them. And one of my best friends was the CEO of the company, and we kind of co-led together over the 5 years I was there. And so, I look at my bookshelves here as we're recording, and I think about people like Adam Grant or Jim Collins or Jacqueline Novogratz or Kim Scott or Seth Godin, all of these people whose ideas were in my brain. And I thought, this is the way workplaces should work. Being the COO of that company was the first time I could test them. It was the first time I could test having a standardized salary system, a profit sharing system to incentivize people to work on behalf of the benefit of the whole company, really deeply personal invitations to connect at the human level between coworkers, orienting ourselves towards a mission, a thing that Nathan, the CEO of the company, doesn't talk about a lot because he's humble and cares about the actual impact, not just doing it for the attention, is that we have a whole giving program where we've had nonprofit partners for years and years that we give hundreds of thousands of dollars to out of the profit of the company to go towards their missions. And so there was just so much that we got to test there to see what really motivates people. Why do people show up? What makes them want to grow a company? And especially in an environment where we had a relatively small team with a relatively large amount of revenue. Everything's relative to what people have experienced in life. If you compare us to Apple or Comcast, we were tiny. If you compare us to a startup just getting started, we were huge. And so, it's all relative. And then on the remote side, remote was beginning to take off. There were crews like the Basecamp crew, Buffer. There were some of these companies that were kind of popularizing it. Automatic was early on in that, which is the parent company of WordPress. And from day one, ConvertKit was remote. People didn't get it. People thought if you start a remote company, it's never going to make it. It just means that you're not serious, you're not working as hard, you're not moving as fast. And I just really made it my mission to say, look, I don't always love working remotely, but I'm going to make this the best strategic advantage that I can. And one of the things you gain when you have a remote company is the whole world is your talent base. Mm-hmm. If you're in San Francisco, your market is San Francisco and whoever will move there. And that's true of any city where you're located locally. And there's great advantages to that. I love working in person. On the remote side, though, the advantage is you can find the best software engineer anywhere in the world. In Wichita, Kansas, there might be a world-class software engineer who cares about being near their family and where they grew up and doesn't want to move to the Bay Area or to New York or to Seattle or wherever. And that person is waiting on a job at a company like ConvertKit to come along. And I made it my mission to go find them. We built a great recruiting system there for going out and finding talent where it was either unrecognized or undervalued relative to its actual market value. And then we brought them in, and that was the way that we were able to kind of fuel this engine with a relatively small team and high ARR per employee. And I just take a lot of pride in that. I think we built a really beautiful culture. I think people really enjoyed working there, and they got a chance to exercise their potential. And we saw the rewards from that. It's a great company. I think they're at something like $40 or $43 million a year in annual recurring revenue at this point. And they've done some secondary sales of employee stock, but they've taken no growth capital along the way. And they've done it all the independent way, which is not to say that's better, but it is a point of pride for sure for that company.
It's doable. Do you think the future is remote?
I think the future is intentional and explicit and transparent. And I don't think that there's a right answer to the remote or on-site game. That whole debate people love to get fired up about. And I know it's not going to make headlines if I say that everyone's wrong. There's no right answer. I think that it really is, first of all, founder specific when companies are getting started. What does the founder prefer? There are a lot of advantages to remote. For example, I think there's some pretty good research now that Adam Grant highlighted recently that introverts tend to do better in remote environments, for example, and they tend to get promoted more often and perform at a higher level. I think that's something that's undervalued by the extroverts of the world like me. And I think for a class of companies, they'll always be in person. I think that for high growth technology startups that want to raise a lot of money from your traditional big VC firms, I just don't think that ecosystem is going to let that happen remotely very often. I think there's more openness to it, but there's a little bit of a dogmatic approach to some of that just says you can't do it the right way when you're remote. And I think because of that, people will always build companies in person. I think corporations that have been built in person, as we've seen, have really struggled with going remote. I think it tends to foster maybe a little bit more of that kind of quiet quitting trend in the big environment where people who have maybe felt like they gave a lot to the company and that they were there at times they didn't need to be, but in chair was valued. And then they go home and they realize, oh, I can get my work done in 3 hours and then I can just kind of putz around and make sure I respond to Slack messages. I think that's a real thing. I do think some people take advantage of it that way. And so in an environment where it hasn't been built remote first, I think it's really hard to go remote. And I think that's why we see a lot of the return to office stuff happening right now is the systems and processes just aren't there for making sure that they're getting the most out of the talented people that work there.
I have two immediate thoughts, and I think the answer is nuanced, as you say. It depends on the circumstances. But what I'm hearing and what I'm thinking right away is that if you're a big company that's been doing things one way, it's very, very hard to switch. I've been in the business 20 years, and I remember a fax machine on a table. And to be honest, I used the fax machine for the first time in my life when I moved to New York to an investment firm. I've never used a fax. And they told me you have to learn how to use a fax. We're going to be using it for as long as you can imagine. And guess what? I haven't used a fax in a long time. So, and I was maybe seen as rebellious because I introduced the firm to a lot of new software, new ways of doing things. And it wasn't easy. I had a lot of pushback from people who would pull me aside and say, when I was your age in the 70s, I could do it with a legal pad and a pencil. Why can't you do it the same way? And I said, I can, but the competition is using software to do it. So just do the math. We have to keep up. So I'm obviously a big fan of remote. I mean, my work has been remote for the last 5 years. And I went to a remote conference even before COVID in Gran Canaria, Spain. And I met people.
So you were early too.
I was early too. And we were using Zoom as a firm, the one where I was before, long before anybody knew what Zoom was. And when I would bring up that topic, people would get very upset with the idea. And then COVID happened and a lot of people tried it. Some of them got even more upset about the idea. But anyways, I don't want to make it all about remote, but it's fascinating how I think smaller, nimble companies like the team you were a part of, it's easier to do. Which, when I think about the future, those that will move faster and disrupt quicker tend to win the game, right? Like that's how it works. So I don't want to extrapolate too far, but it kind of like the fax machine, I kind of knew this thing will go away. And here I feel like very traditional 9 to 5 in an office as a model, 5 days a week. I have a hard time believing that a decade from now that will be a standard. I think there might be some jobs that you have to do this way, but I'm very intrigued by the disruption and the availability of opportunity to more people and the freedom to choose where you're going to live. If you don't like living in the Bay Area and you want to live in Oregon or Wisconsin or anywhere else, do that. But don't give up on the opportunity that comes with it. But that's a whole rabbit hole to explore.
Yeah, there's a whole like systems thinking aspect of that that's just fascinating. How will cities change? How will factories change? There's just so much technology coming online right now that will completely transform the work environment, because, you know, my brain immediately goes to, okay, well, how do we build jet engines without being in person? Well, medium term, it's still people, but 50, 100 years from now, it's probably just more machines. And much like a military drone operator can be in Langley here in the US, operating in the Middle East, you know, not to be desensitized to that. Like, I think that there's a lot of things wrong with that, but a much more innocuous version of that is a factory. And if you can operate a factory from afar because you have a different skill set than sitting there screwing things into the car frame, I think that will make even more jobs available to be done remotely. And so I'm imagining that probably over the very long term, over the hundreds of year time scale, that will probably continue to be the case. There will be less and less need for humans to be making things with their hands, working on site. I think that we'll lose a little part of ourselves in that along the way. I think we'll probably need to find ways to rediscover how to operate in the real world when we're all staring at screens, even building stuff. But also there's a lot of advantages to it. It brings a lot more opportunity to people in places where previously you had to have a chicken deboning factory or a coal mine or whatever in the community in order for people to be employed. That will go away, hopefully. And I think that's the big win to be had from all of this, if we really think in the systems level long term. So that would be my hope, is that it just brings a lot more opportunity to a lot more people.
Yeah, I like that last part. A lot more people can participate because it's available. I'm curious about one of the topics you bring up in your essays. You say that you talk about falling in love with your problems. And I really like that turn of phrase. How do we do that, and how it can help falling in love with our problems?
Yeah. This has been, you know, so much of what I hear on my podcast when I interview people. I would imagine you hear it here too, but so much of what people write online, including myself, is advice to themselves. It's like things that you've learned that you're trying to cement by writing it down. And so this, for me, I was going to go to work for a mentor about 6 years ago. And I asked him, I said, do you have any concerns about me coming to work for you? Because you know me pretty well and you kind of know my tendencies. What do you think would be the failure mode here if this doesn't work out? And he said, well, you are extremely talented at a lot of things, but the one thing I will say is that you tend to find the immovable constraint and then bang your head against that thing over and over. And he said that, and it was just like this lightning bolt of truth about my career and my life, that I always managed to find the unchangeable aspect of what I was doing and then say, well, what if we did change that? It's kind of like the fax machine thing, right? It's like, well, what if we didn't use this dumb machine that's the slowest possible way of getting this done? And I still believe that there's a strength to that, but I also know that when you're working with other people and you're dealing with things like their boundaries, their beliefs, their vision, sometimes you're in conflict over that, right? So there are elements of problems that are just going to always exist, that you can fight and fight and fight and fight and exhaust yourself that way. Or you can fall in love with them and find the aspects that are beneficial to that are a gift, that are an invitation to creativity and to finding new solutions. And I see this in my clients and my coaching practice now all the time. I work with primarily creators, some startup founders, some nonprofit founders. And most of these people have gotten to a point in their business where they're doing $1 million plus in revenue. it's just them or them and a very, very small team, maybe one assistant or 2 employees or something like that. And they've reached this point where they see, wow, I'm like really working myself to death here. I'm making way more money than I need. What do I want? Like, why am I doing this now? And there's this decision point that they get to where they say, do I want to scale a team and grow impact and grow an organization? Or do I want to kind of systematize and stabilize and make it so that I don't have to kill myself to make this money, but so that I can kind of rest easy and continue to do the work necessary to keep it running, but also not work 80 hours a week nonstop forever? And so often, right at that point of decision making, where it's, do we keep growing or do we stabilize? And this happens at many scales of business. A lot of times this is what you see with private equity. They come in, they build systems, they cut fat here and there, they remove team. And then once they get it to a point where the core is stable, they say, okay, let's get profitable. And that's the goal, right, of the model, is to go from high growth, high trajectory, high spending, low efficiency to high efficiency, very stable, very systematized, very profitable, because that's where the return is, right? So it happens at every scale of business. And the thing I see way too often is entrepreneurs and founders, they're like, well, if this one thing would just change, then finally I could live a better life or something like that. And there's 2 ways to think about this. One is, if you're in charge, you got to take your agency back. Is this a problem that you are choosing? Because if you're in charge, you are choosing it on some level, whether it's implicit or explicit. And in that question of, are you choosing this problem, it tends to reshape people's brains where it's like, oh, I could change that, huh? I could not work 80 hours a week. I could hire 5 people tomorrow because I have the money to do it, but then I couldn't put $800,000 in my bank account this year. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's a choice you're making. But prior to that question, many times people feel like they're trapped. And so what I mean when I say fall in love with the problems is choosing your pain, choosing actively the things that are the constraints and whatever it is that you're doing with your life, with your business, with your career, and embracing that actively rather than passively suffering because it exists. And that mind frame shift for people, I have found pretty consistently unlocks something in them that's like this freedom. Oh, at any point, I could decide I'm going to take home half that amount of money and I'm going to hire a team and I'm going to work 30 hours a week. I can pull that switch anytime I want. Now, there's hardship, in that path. But in the meantime, I'm going to choose the pain of working 75, 80 hours a week because I prefer that over making less money. And that's an example of falling in love with the problem, is what was previously this thing holding you back from the life you want becomes an active choice that you're making to embrace and commit to. This problem, this pain is the one I actively want in my life because it's better than the alternative. And I find it to be really powerful as a concept.
I love that idea because instead of running away from problems, you kind of make friends with them and find a way to coexist. The other thing that happens is that a lot of problems, if you just change the perspective a little bit and let go of the grip for a second, you would realize maybe there's an easier way to go about it.
Yeah.
Throwing that fax machine out the window, for example. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting. Somebody told me that I like money problems. They've been listening to a podcast, and I said, that's an interesting way to put it, but I'm more curious about money solutions. How can I not worry about money? What does it take not to worry about money? And, I try to reframe it as, sure, there's a problem, but I'm much more excited about what kind of solutions we can propose. But it's a fun way to play with it. And I think not denying that there will be problems, like any pursuit you choose, right? There will be problems. It's just How do we handle them? Through your work, you've met a lot of exceptional founders, a lot of fascinating people, and I've been listening to your podcast and enjoying it. I'm curious about the most powerful lessons that you walked away from, that kind of rhyme and repeat with a lot of people you talk to.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this because I get to talk, like you, I get to talk to high-performing people who have reached kind of not necessarily the pinnacle, but a pinnacle of success in their field, whatever it is they've chosen to do. And so a few things I found. One is the roots of almost everyone's work are in their childhood. And sometimes you can only see that looking backwards. It's not like they said, oh, look at that thing I used to do as a kid, therefore I'll start this business. Mm-hmm. But as they play it out and they build the business, they can see the threads that go backwards, which is kind of why I love the way that you start your show, which I first found when I was interviewing Paulina Marinova Pompliano, who was on your show. Wonderful human being, great at what she does. And we talked a lot about the roots of how she ended up doing what she's doing and my conversation as you did with her. And so that's the first thing. There's always roots in early life that lead, the threads go forward and lead to where people end up in their careers and their work. The second thing is I see this almost maniacal commitment to excellence in almost everyone that I interview. There's this inner drive towards I must attempt to be the best. It's not that I have to beat everyone. It's not a competitive, I have to beat everyone else that's in this space, but it's this, it's almost this like inner competition with self. Let me see how much better I can get at this thing. And if I'm going to do this, I might as well try and do it the best in the world, because why not? I'm going to do it anyways. I might as well be good at it. And the number of people I've heard on my show say something almost exactly like that. If I was going to do it, I figured I might as well try and be the best. Is fascinating to me that just comes through. A third trend that I see is, I'll call it the immigrant's mindset. The number of people who I have selected because I believe that their work has mattered a lot up to this point, that also happen to be immigrants, is fascinating to me. And even the people who aren't actually immigrants often display the work ethic and qualities that I see in the folks. And we talk about this very directly. It's like, what was your experience like coming to the States and building a life here and reshaping, your personality to fit a new environment in some cases? And there's just this mindset that comes with, my parents sacrificed their entire existence, where they grew up, where they were from, what they were doing, who they loved, to come here scared, alone, unsure of what would come from it, and then to work in whatever job was available to them, whether high level or low level, so that I could start over here or start from scratch here and build a life that I want. And there's just something about that seed that gets planted when that's the mentality, where people feel like they need to pay it back, or maybe pay it forward is a better way of thinking about that. There's like this, I was given this gift and I want to make the most of it kind of attitude. And even in the people who did not move to the States, they've always been here, they're born here, raised here. Many of my guests have that same mentality. I was given this gift from my parents of whatever, and my job now is to make the most of it. I think that's really beautiful, and there's a lot of kind of like poetry in that in many ways. And then the last thing I'll just say is that there's a level of intentionality in all of these people that I talk to, in the way that they lead, and just the little nuanced things they mention along the way. It's like an off the cuff comment. Oh yeah, when people are having a birthday, I do this for them on my team. Or when I'm planning for a board meeting, here's how I prep for that. And it's just like a little one-off comment. And in reality, you think about the cognitive load that comes with that little thing that they mentioned just now, but the impact that it has on the other side of the table, whatever the other side of the table is. Or you hear these people talk about parenting and all the little ways they've made intentional choices of how they want to raise their children so that their children can have the best life possible. It's really, really inspiring. And there are times when I felt like I'm a little bit of a weirdo, like I think too deeply about things that maybe don't matter. And then I talk to some of these peers and some of these people who have done things that I really admire, and I hear the way they do the same thing, and I think, oh, maybe that's actually a good thing. Maybe that's not something to say, oh yeah, I know I'm a weirdo because I do this and that. But it's like, that's what makes me who I am. That's what makes me able to do the things I'm able to do, are these little nuanced things that add up to something really special.
It's okay to be different.
Yeah.
And when I'm listening to you, there are a couple of thoughts that come to mind. So I was born in Poland. I went to schools around Europe. I came to the US, and I talked about it with Paulina quite a bit, who also did the trip to come to America and made America her home. And it is home, and I feel at home here now. But I feel like the experience itself and it could be within one country. You know, I met a lot of people that moved from one end of the country to the other, and they felt, dislocated in a way, and they had to accept that they're different at times. But with that comes a huge power, something that can actually benefit you. At first it feels like, no, I want to blend in. And then you realize, no, it's okay to appreciate that you're different, because you're going to bring to the table the perspective that nobody else has. And I brought up in the show, I remember recommending my first talk in New York, investment firm, old school. I looked around the room, long table, and I was the only one that was not born in the US. Never went to school in the US. All my degrees are from Europe. And I was thinking, I'm bringing something to this table, although I'm the youngest probably at this table right this minute, and I was 24. But I'm bringing something that none of them can bring, because I'm looking from outside at a problem they've been looking at the same way because of the same schools, the same background, the same everything. And I thought, I can tap into this and it can help me. And ever since, I think I grew to appreciate that aspect instead of trying to run away from it and pretend to be just like everybody else.
It's beautiful.
You said something about that subtle element, and I don't have the best way to describe it, but I just recorded with Tom Morgan, who you might be familiar with. Mm-hmm. He has his leading edge venture these days, and he's the curiosity guru out there, a fascinating guy, a good friend. And one of the topics we talked about, which rhymes with what you just brought up, and I think there's something bigger there, that when you watch somebody successful, you think you can quantify it the way you want to quantify Warren Buffett, right? Buy stocks like that in industries like this, and so on and so on. And a lot of things I think we can actually, get inspired. But there are those subtle things that you pointed out, the birthday cake or a handshake or something that you see. That is the little secret that makes all the difference, right? And I don't want to ignore it, because that subtle little thing that you might not even acknowledge at first can make all the difference. Why this person will notice something and the other person will not see it at all. I don't have the ultimate answer, but anytime I hear that, and you brought it up, it makes me think that there's some gold hiding in there with the subtle element.
Really strongly believe this. Sometimes I think it can feel almost pedantic when I'm working with someone. I'll give two examples. We ran a conference at ConvertKit called Craft and Commerce, and it was kind of designed to fill this gap in the creator world where you get lots of conferences that are kind of software centric. They're a little bit focused on the company that's hosting them. And then you get conferences that are very kind of creative. It's all about kind of the craft of making stuff. There wasn't anything that was at the intersection of truly creator focused, but also money focused. How do you make an actual living at this? And so it was really important to me that we were in the background. ConvertKit was in the background. It was not the point of the conference. It was not like we were selling you our it wasn't a user conference, it was a creator conference. And one of the things I believed very strongly is that while the talks aren't really the point of a conference, they do set the tone for the whole thing. And they kind of give the container within which community happens and connection happens. And so two things that mattered a lot to me were, we wanted to have people on stage that were representative of the full kind of breadth of the creator market that we were serving. When people look up on stage, they see the potential for them to reach that point someday. And it's important for that to be representative, in my opinion. But also, we wanted to have some people talk who had never given talks before, because that's probably the best stuff. Mm-hmm. It's like the same people give the same talks over and over, and it gets tired. But it's the people who are really building that you want to hear talk about the stuff. And the reason many of those people don't is they've never done it before. It's scary. It's one of the top things people fear, is getting up in front of a room of people and giving a talk. So we decided we were going to actively seek those people out and give them the tools to be successful. So we hired a speaker coach. His name's Mike Pacquione. He's one of my really good friends here in Oregon. And we said, Mike, it's your job to work with every one of these main stage speakers and make sure they feel comfortable giving their 20 or 25 minute talk. We hired him. Normally, a conference would say, well, you're the speaker, you figure that out. But we felt like, well, this is our event. This is the product, basically, is the talks that get given. And I think that made a really big difference in people's both willingness to participate as a speaker and also their desire to talk about it after the fact. Was they felt resourced. Now, did they all feel like after the fact they knocked it out of the park? No, because it's their first time sometimes. But that's fine. We gave them the opportunity to. And then the second thing was I felt like most events, when a speaker gets introduced, and this is going to get into my more personal life example, you read off a sheet, right? And there's a reason for that. Most speakers want to be introduced a certain way. And I really respect that. But also as the organizer of the thing, there's a reason I wanted every one of these people to give a talk. There's like a heartfelt reason that I was attracted to this person as a message. And I think there's a wider theme here of someone needs to be the host of an event. Someone is the one who's brought it all together and said, this was the vision. This is why you're here. This is how we act when we're together here. And so we decided we were going to have MCs. So I was one of the MCs and one of my colleagues, Alexis, was an MC. And our job was to get up there and set the context. Here's why we do this event. Day one, session one. Here's why we do this event. Here are some questions for you to be thinking about on this first day. And here's a prompt that you can use when you meet someone new and you're feeling awkward so that you can get into conversation without it being this like weird dance of small talk and posturing and all of this. And we jump up there between every speaker and give a little extra context on why this person's here and what they're great at and what we see in them. And if we go back to my mission, there's an element of that that's kind of like calling people higher. When I give a really heartfelt introduction to Talking Billions and why I love it and why it stood out to me when I was studying Paulina's life and then why I went on to listen to other episodes, that's different from whatever you would send me in an email to read. And so this parlays into, I love hosting dinner parties or this fishing trip that I just did and creating environments where people can connect on a much deeper level. It's not like, who are you? What have you done? What's your job? Impress me. It's, who are you? What's in your heart? What do you want to be seen for? How do you need support right now? Like the really human stuff. And I find that if you ask someone to introduce themselves at a dinner table, they do one of two things. They either feel like they have to put on a show and prove to you how special they are, or they completely understate how great they are. And they don't want to come across as pompous or conceited or whatever. And so I just decided sometime, 8 or 10 years ago, well, I'm going to be the one to introduce everyone if I host something, because I know what's awesome about every person. And it's not awkward for me to brag about them, especially if I do it for everyone.
Right.
And so now every time I get a new group of people together, not at like a big event, but at a 8 or 10 person thing, I take 20 minutes and I just introduce each person. And I say, here's what I love about this person. Here's why you should want to know them. And here's a point of connection between two of you in the room or something like that. And I think about it ahead of time, but it's kind of off the cuff. It's one of these things where now friends kind of expect it. And they're like, I love being introduced by Barrett. It makes me feel good about myself. He sees me in a way sometimes I don't even see myself. And again, it comes back to, I think more often we got to reflect back to people what we see in them, because that calls them up to this higher level of what they're capable of, whether it's just in being a friend or whether it's at work. And so often we're in these inner narratives of like, oh, I screwed that up, or I messed that up, or I could have done better there. And then you get a complete break from that in a moment. And it's like, damn, I guess he was introducing me. He just talked about me. And I was listening to that like, oh man, I'd like to be that person. And what I'm saying is you are. That's how I see you, right? And it would be so easy to skip that step and just say, let's go around the room and introduce ourselves. And I just find that doing those little things like that really can change the entire tenor of an experience. So anyways, to go into probably way more detail than you wanted, I think these are the kinds of things that really shape environments and teams. And ultimately, teams are what make impact. Teams are what change the world. Small teams and big teams. And I think it takes these leadership qualities of the really, really detailed attention to nuance that shape those environments.
No, I love the sound of that, and I'm glad you're doing that, because for a lot of people that moment, let's go around the room and say a few words about myself. as you said, ideally you just undersell yourself and you don't really say what you're about. And you don't really give yourself a chance to meet people, but to have somebody else brag a little bit about you. And I'm thinking of Guy Spear, who's a good friend, who has this idea that he shines light on people during his events. He introduces one person and then shines light on the other person. I thought it's such a great idea because it allows the other people in the room to see, oh, that's why I want to talk to Barrett. And it's a really cool way of breaking the ice, and you don't have to be the one that says how great you are. I'm sure you're great, and let somebody else say it for you. I'm glad you do that. I want to bring up a topic that's been coming up in my conversations one way or the other, mostly off the record, outside of the podcast. So I want to bring it to the podcast. And I hinted it to you. You write about some tools that you use in your coaching work. And I want to specifically zoom in on Richard Schwartz and the internal family systems framework. Surprisingly enough, or not, a couple of people brought it up to me, including some of the members of the audience, and some of them might be listening now and cheering on. Let's talk about it. But you bring up that topic and you use some of the tools of the framework. And I'm no therapist, and this is not a psychology podcast, but I feel like there's some tools that are worth talking about. Can you tell us, complete newbies, I actually have read quite a bit by now about it, but for newbies listening, what's it all about? Why is it helpful? How do you use it?
Yeah. So let me give a quick wider context on this, and then I'll give my summary of it, which will be imperfect, of course. So I've had this long-running debate with one of my friends, closest friends. He's a founder, very talented founder, raised a lot of money, invested a lot of money. You know, the kind of person you look at and be like, oh, wow, they're the kind of person I want to be if I'm going to be a founder in Silicon Valley. And the long-running debate has been over the value of therapy and coaching and whether there is value there. And of course, I'm a guy who loves nuance, so I don't fall in one camp or the other. But what I do think is true is there are versions of both that are not helpful, and there are versions of both that are very helpful. And the long-running conversation has become about what's the difference? What is the difference between very high impact, high value coaching or therapy, which are different things, but in the same realm in terms of helping people develop their psychology? And if I had to define the core difference, it's that some coaching and therapy serves primarily to validate the existing experience of the person across the table from the coach or therapist. I see you. That sounds hard. Your feelings are real. I'm sorry you're going through that. And there is real value to that when someone has gone their whole life and no one has ever acknowledged their experience of life. And so I don't want to downplay the value of that. And there comes a point where, let's call it over a 3-year therapy or coaching relationship, if that is all that's being done, there's no transformation happening. You've gone from something very valuable, which is being seen and understood for the first time, to something repetitive and that kind of entrenches your existing emotional experience. The goal, in my opinion, of great coaching or therapy is to create transformation over time. Not with a burdensome, if you show up in my chair across from me as a client, I expect you to transform. Dance monkey. That's not it. My role is to be here, but also to be the mirror that helps you transform over time in the way that best serves you. And so to the extent that coaching and therapy result in transformation, I think it's great. And it is something very valuable in the world. And to the degree that it leaves someone entrenched in their existing experience and place and unhappiness at whatever level that exists, I think it can be unhelpful. That's the big difference to me. One of the kind of methodologies or frameworks that I've seen consistently across the board when people mention it to me be transformational for them is internal family systems. So that's the context for how we get to me talking about this thing. I personally have had that experience as well. The two modalities I've heard in therapy that have worked the best and most consistently for people that talk about it are internal family systems and EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization, something like that. EMDR, you can look it up. the reason that I think that these things work is similar to the reason that psychedelics work. They are ways of going inward and breaking down the constructs of our minds or our personalities in a way that allow us to see them more clearly and then to change them actively over time with a lot of effort. So family systems is a pretty well-established framework for the ways that our personalities are shaped by the families that we grow up in. It's rooted in attachment theory, which is the idea that as a small child or baby, you are attached to the people that are caring for you because your life literally depends on it. And so much of our personality gets shaped in response to the caretakers in our lives when we're very small. And there are dynamics within families that are created based on that. Mom plays this role, dad plays this role, I play this role, sibling plays this role. Birth order is a version of this, if you've read any about how birth order shapes personality. So internal family systems, which Richard Schwartz was kind of the pioneer of, he said, I wonder if there's actually an inner version of this that happens where we have different aspects of our personality that gets expressed in different environments or in response to different triggers. And these are almost coping mechanisms for painful events or challenging environments or just what we do to survive. Sometimes it's not like this big T trauma type thing that happens. It's just like, I thought I needed to be, pacifist in my environment at home so that my parents would put food on the table. That's not actually true. That's just the way our brain got shaped, right? Okay, so what you can imagine internal family systems as being is, let's imagine you have a dinner table and there's 6 or 8 people sitting around it. Maybe it's representative of your family and the family that was closest to you outside of your nuclear unit. And each of those people sitting around the table is an element of your personality. So some of mine, for example, are, I've got one I call the saint. That's like this very highly moralist type view on the world. There is right and there is wrong and there is no in between. So that's one part. There is a perfectionist part of me that's like, there's only one way to do a thing and it's the perfect way. There is this thing I call the chaos monkey. And the chaos monkey's job when it expresses itself in my personality is like, it sees a trigger, a stress trigger for me. And it says, don't look at that. Don't look at the actual problem. Look over here at this thing that's trying to kill you in the environment or inside your body or whatever. And so like an example of that is it expressed itself as hypochondria for a long time. It wanted to convince me I was sick or about to die of something anytime there was another stressor that was completely unrelated to health. And so I had to really dissect that and understand it so that then I could be like, oh, look at that. Little chaos monkey over here is doing that thing where it says something is killing you right now. But what actually happened is I need to have a hard conversation at work and I feel out of alignment with either myself or a colleague because of what happened yesterday. And once I could collapse that from like a 30-day process to a 2-hour process, my life changed. So IFS, or internal family systems, is the process of identifying these different internal parts of ourselves so that we can see how they get expressed in response to different triggers. And then just begin to create a little gap in the middle where we say, oh, I see what's happening there. Thank you so much for playing that role that you've played my whole life. That was very important for a period of time. But actually, I've got this now. I don't need you to act like that anymore. I can solve this for myself. And so there's this kind of idea of self-energy, which is the adult, capable, well-respected you that is able to play the role that all these parts are trying to play to protect you, if these parts will allow it. And so it's a almost internal trust building process to say like, hey, chaos monkey, if you didn't have to play this job of running around and making me think I was dying, what role would you play? And what I found was it would just be playful. It would literally just go play. It would find ways to have fun and create joy for people and play games. And it just needed me to know that when stress triggers happen, I will address them. I won't just leave them there to like fester. And I've realized that this can sound a little crazy in the same way that like someone goes and does ayahuasca and it's like, oh my God, that sounds absurd. But it's just a little system or framework that really helps you begin to see the way you behave in the world in a different way And for whatever reason, the methodology is very effective.
I think you beautifully framed it, and I highly recommend anybody curious to explore more. There are quite a few books about it and podcasts, and there are actually interviews with Dr. Schwartz himself, and he explains how he sees it. For me, it's a map, it's a legend, it's an interpretation of the world, right?
Yes.
And find it useful, don't find it useful, up to you. I'm no therapist, and I don't make any claims here, but I found it very intriguing that so many people pointed me in that direction to explore. And in the work that I do, I invest money for wealthy individuals, for families. And I grew to appreciate, obviously, the technical, scientific side to it, building a portfolio, having a collection of businesses. But then I see the empathy, compassion needed on the emotional side of it. What does this money mean to you? And what Dr. Schwartz says is that listening to his patients, he noticed that they're talking about multiple people, voices, personalities, guests at that dinner table that are talking to them. And when you really start to pay attention, you notice people say, I ate the cake because that part of me made me do it. Or I had to sell that stock because that part of me made me do it. I couldn't hold it anymore. It was too painful to hold it. People talk about it as if it was a real physical experience of holding a hot brick or something, right? Like, I couldn't hold this stock. I had to sell it. It made me do it. He made me do it. Who is he? And then you realize you're using all that vocabulary that he is trying to interpret for you. So I've been hearing those stories from people, and I was always wondering who made you eat the cake or who made you sell the stock. And that's why I found that framework helpful to try to understand yourself a little bit. And one last thing I'm going to add, you said something about the distance, and I find it very, very helpful to realize that, and we talked about, control or empowering yourself, but there are all those personas there talking to you, making you allegedly do things. But if you actually turn it around, turn it into a game, I thought of it as a play a little bit. Listen to that monkey. What do you want? I see you. I hear you. How can I help? What else would you like to do? If you let me take care of it. I have one last thing, I promise it's the last thing, but he says that all those personas, if you ask them about their age, they're less than 10.
Yep.
And it rhymes with so many things that I've heard on the emotional side of money, that our habits get shaped even around our understanding of risk, rewards, money in general, and all the framework that comes to play when you're managing somebody's money. A lot of that has been set in stone by the age of 9, 10, 11. Different studies talk about it. It's fascinating. That's why I asked about childhood and upbringing, if my guests allow me to take that trip, because sometimes we discover things that my guests haven't thought about for 3 decades.
Yes.
And they choke up and tear up and they say, you know what? My dad said this, or my mom said this. That's why. And I'm absolutely fascinated with the actual why. You talked about your trip with your friends to the woods, and not asking people, what's your title? Do you have a corner office? But what are you really about? Like, what is the why? And it's all connected somehow. Mm-hmm. And the more tools we can have, the better.
That's right. I'll add one last piece, and then we can move on, because some people won't be interested, and that's fine. Most of the people sitting around the dinner table, in this idea, this metaphor for internal family systems, their job is to protect a younger version of you.
Yes.
It's a mechanism for, at age 8, this thing happened. And this part popped up as a way to deal with that kind of thing going forward. Mm-hmm. And as you start to decode that stuff, if you imagine, like, in the middle of the table, sitting cross-legged is little 8-year-old you. Mm-hmm. And another way of thinking about these parts, to your point, is, so what are you protecting me from? What are you protecting 8-year-old me from? And what are you protecting 8-year-old me from? And it's really fascinating to be able to begin to understand that about yourself. And there's a finite amount of these experiences, right, that are just really, really formative. And to your point, once you have the map of them, you can just say, oh, look at how that thing is popping up in my life at the age of 38 or whatever. Like, that is wild. Mm-hmm. And it just becomes a little more light, a little easier to handle, because you can be so much more compassionate when it's just like, yeah, that is how an 8-year-old would respond, huh? And look at me, I'm 38. I'm great. I can do this now.
We don't have to act that way anymore, but we have to listen to that voice just for a second.
That's right.
To respect it. There's so much to explore on that front. I wanted to bring it up because the topic came my way so many times that I thought I'd love the audience to know about it the same way I discovered it. And I'm learning. I'm curious. Anything that helps, I find it useful to some extent. I do want to ask you about your definition of success before you fly away, but I want to bring up one more thing from your essays that really resonated with me. You talk about building expertise before starting a business. And I want to bring it up because I think there's this culture these days of, you jump off the cliff and you build the wings. I forgot who said it, and I don't want to pick on anybody, but I think there is a benefit in acquiring experience and expertise. I launched 2 investment firms in the last 10 years and spent previous 10 at one firm, the most recent one this year. And I'm really grateful for the expertise I acquired in the previous 2 decades. And in many ways, I don't think I would be able to do it the way I've done it without that expertise. That's why that remark really struck a chord with me. But share more.
So this originated when I was at a business called Fizzle. And I had started a business about a year out of college called Living for Monday that ended up failing. I was very interested in why businesses fail. And what I saw consistently, we were kind of like the lynda.com for creators before the creator economy had become a big thing. So we were teaching everything from how to come up with a business idea all the way to like how to analyze your detailed Google Analytics reports and your creative business and everything in between. And I saw this trend that really bothered me in the creator world, which was you'd get these people who would quit their jobs and they'd start following Fizzle or Pat Flynn, who's this guy who runs a podcast called Smart Passive Income, or any of these teachers online that are teaching you how to run a creator business. And what would end up happening is as they would learn this stuff, they would start teaching it themselves. And I noticed this pattern that looked a lot like a pyramid scheme to me, where you had people who had legitimately done things teaching how to create creator businesses, and then people quitting their jobs who would go learn from those people. And rather than applying it to a very specific area or business, they would then start teaching it, and on and on and on and on and on. And the information would just get more and more diluted the further down the pyramid you went. And it wasn't necessarily really a pyramid scheme in that way, but it felt a lot, it rhymed with, Cutco knives or whatever, that is a multi-level marketing business. And I was really bothered by that because it felt like, well, I don't want to contribute to that. I don't want us to be contributing to that ecosystem of things. I want people to really go build stuff in the world. And so I started looking for counter examples. Who are the people who have built what I'll call verticals as their business rather than just regurgitating what they've learned? Someone teaching about wine, someone teaching about resources for classroom teachers in the public education system, someone teaching pattern making or making beats for rap music or like whatever. There's any, infinite permutations of this type of stuff. Anything other than here's how to start an online business. And what I found was mostly the reason or the difference between those two groups of people who built businesses, what I would call real businesses based on a vertical versus people who regurgitated, was expertise. It was people who had spent 5 to 10 years getting good at a topical piece of information, investing, beat making, pattern making, whatever. And then they took that expertise and said, let me go learn the skills of online business and apply that to this thing I know really well. Those people, it took them way less time to be successful, and they tended to scale faster to an amount of revenue that allowed them to both earn a full-time living and build wealth. And so I said, well, no one's going to want to hear this, but my observation is that you should go, if you think you want to start a business, you should go spend 5 years learning something first, right, and then start a business based on that thing. And everyone's like, oh yeah, screw off, Barrett, because it's like, if you want to quit your job today, that's not advice that helps.
No.
But in some way it does, because it says take the patient approach, because it will actually save you time in the end. Now, there's environments where that's not necessarily the case. If there's a unique set of things that is true about life at the age of 22 when you're getting funded by Y Combinator, that is not true at the age of 35 when you've got 2 or 3 kids and a wife and a mortgage and all of these things. And I do think there is real value in leveraging that asset, which is lack of responsibility, to start a business early on. And I think that's where a lot of this kind of investor advice can come from, is like, get started now, get started before you know where you're going, and figure it out as you go. And I think there's certain types of businesses where that can be true. But I also think that you're a lot more likely to succeed if you actually know a space and then start a business based on that.
It sounds like it's more nuanced depending on the environment and the industry. But right. I think we take it as a blanket statement. Listen, I don't have to know anything. I can just get started. I think in some situations, true. At 22, you can work around the clock. You don't have any other obligations, and you can learn very quickly. But there's so many fields that 5, 10, or 20 years of experience will make a big difference. It'll get you going.
Let me add one thing here, and then I know we got to move on. I had a mentor one time say something to the effect of, you don't have to follow the rules in a given space, but you do need to know them. And so if you're trying to write a memoir, for example, but you've not read the 25 greatest memoirs of all time, you are doing yourself and your potential readers a great disservice. Because it's not that you need to follow the formula of the 25 greatest memoirs, because there's probably 25 formulas across those books. But it's that every great genre or every great vertical of a business or set of expertise has some tenets you do have to know. And even the like beloved entrepreneurial success story of Elon Musk that people love to talk about, if you read that Ashley Vance biography about him, the like 10-year-old one now, when he was learning about rockets, he went and found the world's best experts and then just peppered them with tens and hundreds of hours of questions to learn the fundamentals. And then he said, not, I'm going to break the fundamentals of physics, but the economic model based on these fundamental rules of physics is broken due to government participation in this market. I'm going to go break the economic model. And that is a very different thing that was based in expertise. It was based in rapid expertise acquisition, and he had the resources to go do that. But that is completely different from just saying, I'm starting a rocket company, even though I don't know anything about that because I used to work at PayPal. Those are very different things.
No, I'm glad you shared that distinction, and I think it's a great example. Before you fly away, I want to ask you about your definition of success. How do you think about it?
It's interesting. I go on these trips, like the one I mentioned at the top of the conversation that I just came back from, to stay connected to what really matters to me. And I found myself feeling very kind of melancholy last night. I was so grateful to be home to my 2 sons and my wife, but I was also very sad to be away from this experience that I look forward to all year. And I was thinking about why, and really just letting the emotion exist, to some of our earlier points. And what I realized was that in a moment where you are away from all outside influence, and it's you and 12 other people, all of whom you care about and are there for a reason, the purpose of life in that moment gets very clear. It's just to be present here with these people that I care about. And I got some really nice notes from guys who were on the trip. Just things like, I really enjoyed it. It was such a, great moment for me to just think about my life and have good conversation and get away from all the worries of day to day. And I think on some level, that's what success is. It's being in environments with people that create the space for transformation, for people to change towards whatever it is they're capable of or whatever it is they want more of in their life. And if I can be a catalyst for that, whether it's through hosting a dinner party or a fishing trip or taking on coaching clients or hosting my podcast, for these moments of transformation that call people to a higher version of what they're capable of being. And maybe occasionally if I can inspire them to go apply that somewhere that's of great service in the world, like we talked about with my mission, or how I view my mission in the world, I don't think if I collect little stories of that, little anecdotes of that from individuals along the course of my life, I really think that will add up to quite a bit. You know, I think about every one of those stories as being the kind of person that would want to be at your funeral on the last day of your life, and would want to be able to tell that story as an example of who you were and the kind of influence you had, kind of influence I had. I just don't think there's anything better. You know, if I had a couple hundred people in the room sharing that kind of story, I think that's a life well lived.
I love it. I love it. And many of them are listening to this podcast today. Barrett, thank you so much for today. It was such a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to many more conversations.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show. One click for you means the world to us. Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogumil Baranowski.